With all the hustle and bustle of the Rings of Power season 2 coming out, there's new fresh articles, new fresh opinions
Mm,
online that are
mm,
apologizing, that are saying like
yes.
apologists
Yes.
of the Rings of Power abomination. Now, we're going to go through this fresh new article that I discovered on the internet. And this article is called "The Best Part of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is Why I Just Can't Hate the Rings of Power." So we're going to
Dude,
be go ahead.
the all of this, the reception of Rings of Power itself, the topics, the conversation on the internet, everything, the hate towards the fans, all of it is becoming almost as epic a and nuanced a saga as The Lord of the Rings. It's
It's
so big. There's so
yeah,
much you can dive into. Videos, um, promotional material,
right.
tweets, articles. It's incredible, and
Yeah.
dude, I love every second of it.
So this article is written by Angel Shaw, who is a senior staff writer at Screen
Mhm.
Rant. All right.
Nice. No
Um,
pronouns in the
no
bio,
pronouns.
obviously.
It's very rude of her to not include those.
Them. Don't assume.
The name's Angel. All right.
Yeah, but that's that could be a guy's name.
True.
I've known Mexican guys named Angel.
Yo, Angel.
They say Angel.
Angel. All right.
Mhm.
So let's dive into this as an introduction. The Rings of Power has faced a lot of heat since it was first announced, but one of the greatest aspects of J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings won't allow me to hate this series. As one of the most iconic pieces of fantasy, it's no surprise that fans are intensely protective of the Lord of the Rings. Correct.
Mhm.
I think with
Yes.
good reason. However, Tolkien's unique method of storytelling makes Lord of the Rings perfect source for makes Lord of the Rings a perfect source for adaptation, which is why I find many criticisms of the Rings of Power. So
Many criticisms of the Rings of Power unfair.
unfair, right, right.
Ah.
So that's the main that's the main premise. So this person, Angel's going to go on a deep dive as to why they think the Rings of Power is not as big of an abomination, right?
Yeah, and I don't wanna read this whole paragraph, but the last sentence, the problem is that Tolkien never had a single canon for The Lord of the Rings.
So the basic
Boy.
idea is actually something that we were making fun of in a recent podcast. Is kind of the idea that the Lord of the Rings books is based around. It's like an adaptation it's like a historical account that that Tolkien found,
Yeah.
right? And it was written from the perspective of Baggins and Frodo and Sam and
Yeah, it was
descendants.
like
You
a
know what I mean?
manuscript, like
A
these people
manuscript,
that nobody remembers ever existed because
right?
it's so far it's in the past. Like, they wrote it. They wrote down this history, and the reason that it's almost like we're living in the age of men,
Right, right. So
you
the
know?
first Angel makes four main points. We're going to go through each of these. So Tolkien wrote his Lord of the Rings books like real world history. Why? Could you go ahead and read this
Okay.
paragraph right here for
That's a
me?
true statement. I'm trying to figure out how to pronounce this. Tolkien was a philo
Philologist.
philologist. I've never had to say that word, which basically means he was a historian and a linguist with a profound interest in the passing down of written and oral story. He was an expert in European history and folklore, and this played a significant role in The Lord of the Rings. Rather than simply writing down a story about a creature called a hobbit who found a magical ring, Tolkien approached his work as if someone else had written them centuries before, and that he had simply discovered and translated them. This found manuscript literary device allowed Tolkien a great deal of flexibility in his legendarium.
Okay, so based on just that idea, which also interestingly enough, there's actually at the bottom of this article I had pre-read. They keep quoting things, right?
Yeah.
and they don't source the quotes, and so there's a section at the bottom that I'll get to when we get there, where it
Okay.
makes it sound as if like they wrote it out as if it's a quote from Tolkien, but it's not, because I
Mm,
googled the quote, and the only thing that comes up on Google is this article. So I
right.
don't know who said these quotes. Anyways, um, so the central story of Lord of the Rings was meant to be contain, uh, contained within the Red Book of West March, in an in-world volume written collectively by Bilbo Baggins, Frodo Baggins, Sam Gamgee, and Sam's descendants. So that's was sort of stuff we've already covered. And then the Silmarillion were meant to be records of other such ancient texts written from the perspective of elves in Middle Earth, left behind to preserve their history. Okay, so right there, the argument that a literary novel is kind of it also depends on that. It brings up the argument, if like the Silmarillion, which is based around the Second Age, you know what I mean?
Hmm.
If it was intended to be a historical account, then right there I feel like the idea of it being not taken literally is incorrect. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? Because
Yeah.
if the ancients were to write a historical count, then they wouldn't have just messed it up or intended for you to, you know,
As well
change
as,
it.
if we're assuming that elves wrote these historical accounts, how fallible are elves?
Pretty
This
not.
ancient species. Don't you think they would perfectly record their histories? Also, this is a strange perspective simply because it's not like the Fire and Blood novel that George Martin wrote, which
Right.
is these events from the perspective of different people and maesters and all these different characters giving their own version of events. There is only one version of events.
Hmm.
Um, and if you look at the movies versus the books and say, well, this is maybe an alternate series of events, or the movies versus the books. I don't think so. I think it's simply an adaptation.
Right.
Everybody wants to say, it's different timelines, it's different, universes. Not everything is a universe, not everything's a timeline. It's an
Right.
adaptation.
Right. Right. The next interesting point that so Angel makes a illustration as to why it was, from Tolkien's perspective, written loosely. All right. So
Ah,
Tolkien's approach means there isn't only one version of canon. So in the go ahead and read this, Wyatt, if you wouldn't mind.
Tolkien's found manuscript approach to his works meant a great deal of flexibility with his legendarium, according to who. For example, after The Hobbit had already been published, he conceived the idea for The Lord of the Rings, but recognized that the original version of Bilbo's story, in which Gollum willingly bet the One Ring and easily handed it over, contradicted the idea that Gollum's ring was Sauron's great weapon. So he retconned the original story, republished a version in which Bilbo basically stole the One Ring, and included a note stating that Bilbo had simply lied about how he attained it.
This is interesting because it is not, this is in the middle of Tolkien's world building.
Yeah.
There, that, because Tolkien, as he was figuring it out, already had a book published, and he wanted to fit that into the character's personality
Hmm.
inside the book of Bilbo.
Yeah.
It's just kind of what we talked about. You know, Bilbo the Hobbit, he writes as if there's an exaggerated, he tells stories in an
Hmm.
exaggerated way to make a story better. That does not mean that there is more than one version
Right.
of the history of
Yeah, and
Middle Earth.
if he retconned it, then he's basically amending his story to follow one version, right?
Correct.
Um, we can't look at like Lucas's Star Wars movies and say, like, clearly he retconned stuff. If you go
Hmm.
back and look and analyze the movies, there's some pretty clear plot holes and things in there. But it's his story to retcon,
Well, that's
and
the thing.
It's his continuity.
Yes, it's his continuity, but also so the writer has the right to do that, but that does not mean that there's multiple versions of Middle-earth's history. What essentially happened was he established when he didn't retcon the story. What he did was he used a change he wanted to make while he was world building and story
Mhm.
building to ingrain deeper the actual purpose and the actual like actions of Gollum to solidify what actually happened. Not well, there's two different versions of this, and so you're just reading Bilbo's translation of it, which he just lied about it or something. And that's just not correct. Yes, in the world building, Tolkien might have changed it in the writing of the story, but he changed it in order to solidify its true meaning, which means there's not two versions, there's one version, and he's using it as a character development device, right?
Yeah. What I'm starting to see here, um, is that the writer of this article seems to be going out of their way to make points, and give essentially their own context in order to justify their opinion about the Rings of Power.
Right. Yeah. Well, they're on a mission to defend the Rings of Power because
Mhm.
they happen
I don't
to
I
like
don't
it
think it's
of some
defend.
kind.
I don't think it's defend. It's justify the
It justifies,
existence
sure.
justify the existence of the Rings of Power, because you
Right.
can't watch the show. I don't think anybody can watch the show and say that it is a great show.
Or the biggest thing that
How
everyone has a
deluded
problem
do you
with.
have to be?
Right, right. And also the idea of just saying, okay, well, because Tolkien made changes, like very minor changes to the story when he was crafting the concept. The fact that he went out of his way to make such a detailed account of the history of Middle Earth, not only the second and first age and the battles that took place in characters, all the way to the creation, the god character, Au, Iluvatar, who the Valar are. Is
Mhm.
the fact that he went into that much detail to lay it out for you does not give you the right to all of a sudden or to defend or justify just a retelling of the actions of characters and the movements and the historical events of Middle Earth to twist it to the way you think is more adaptable in 2024. Like that's just so ridiculous. You don't have the right to do that. If anyone had the right to do that, it would be Tolkien. I argue not even uh, not only his son and definitely not his grandson should have the right to do that. These are bodies of work that exist,
Mhm.
and if he wanted to change something, he could. They also go on to say other examples can be found all throughout Tolkien's Middle Earth legendarium, the Silmarillion. The unfinished tales of Numenor and Middle Earth are full of different versions of the same story. Tolkien's various documented letters reveal that the author specifically let some questions unanswered. So that doesn't. So basically, they're saying because there are things unanswered in the history of Middle Earth, you
Mhm.
get to change the questions that are answered?
Right.
No. It just
No.
means that there are gaps in time in the historical records. It does not mean you can change the characters and the movement of existing
Mhm.
events, right?
Right. Yeah, and it's really difficult to, I don't know, look at the what Tolkien wrote and say, well, this I this is all clearly could be different stories and versions of the events we could, change, and maybe there's, the stories are supposed to be different. They're not supposed to be different. It's supposed to feel like a history, which is often broken.
Right.
And that doesn't give you leeway to change it or to come up with your own canon.
No, for sure not. For sure not.
It's
Um,
this idea that we can't preserve the works of the author. We have to change them. I don't get it. It's like clearly there's been lots and lots of people over the years that want to work to preserve this author's legacy and
Yeah.
what they wrote, and make sure that it, continues. It's already stood the test of time. This just uh, again, it's excuses to justify something that breaks the canon, that insults the author's vision.
Right. And the vision that was laid out. That's the
Mhm.
important thing. So the next section is sort of they don't mind the Rings of Power making changes to the Second Age. When Tolkien's canon is considered a single cohesive story, I understand why audiences who would be frustrated with screen adaptations making changes. I myself cringe when great books are demolished by screenwriters for the sake of making money. However, I prefer to look at Lord of the Rings and other Middle Earth stories the way Tolkien did, as tales and legends recorded by scholars during a time long past. They are flexible, living, breathing things that can be interpreted differently depending on who has taken up the story to pass it on to the next generation.
Let's look at this in the lens of what we see nowadays, which is not the maintaining of legacy, but it is the taking it up like a mantle. Iron Man is a mantle. Spider Man is a mantle.
Right.
Captain America is a mantle. No, they were individual heroes and characters.
Right.
Um, Lord of the Rings is not a mantle.
Mm,
You don't somebody doesn't take up this story. It's
right.
Tolkien's story, and I think we keep coming back to that. We keep having to reiterate that. This argument isn't a terrible argument for some things, but for this story, it does not
Mhm.
work
I think
because
it applies to a couple writer story, but this is
yeah.
kind of like the gold standard, right?
Mhm.
And then here's a quote that again have no idea who this is from. When I
Right.
look it up, it doesn't exist anywhere except in this article. A quote that says, "Like any other legend, this keeps the Lord of the Rings alive. If it doesn't evolve, the story will eventually go extinct." I don't know
Wrong,
who freaking said that. I don't. That's the
but you're
stupidest thing I've ever
wrong.
heard.
I that
That sounds
That's
like 2024
we're talking about
PC.
legends. That is a legendarily idiotic quote. I feel like this person is putting their own quotes into these sections and being like, "I'm referencing something," but really I'm
I'm
making these
referencing a
up,
past
right?
article I've written.
It's like when you're at school and you start telling jokes and being like, "No, no, no, I heard this from someplace, but it's your joke," and you wanted to get passed around the school so that people, but if you tell people that you made it up, they may
Right.
not like it as much. No, that's an actually it's a wrong quote. Things do not have to evolve in order to be um, legendary. That's what makes it a legend. Is it's this um, perfect isolated event
Right.
or person or story, and because of its greatness and inherent enjoyment or terror or wonder, it's so great that it is legendary. If
Mhm.
you change that thing, it ceases to be what it was
Correct.
and is therefore no longer legend.
Right, right. They also use this very strange example. Storytelling is a universal human experience, and we've been doing it for thousands of years. Stories about Thor
Mhm.
and other Norse gods got their start from peoples whose names we will never know, but these tales still adapt into movies and TV shows, if ever of ever possible genres today. Since Tolkien's approached Middle Earth with the same energy, he did not. He did not approach it with that same energy, but
Mhm.
whatever. I don't mind seeing series like The Rings of Power make changes and reshaping the Legendarium so that it can be passed on to even more audiences. Who
Why?
needs to change it
Yeah,
in order for all the other audiences to enjoy it?
every people yeah, it doesn't need to change for more audiences to enjoy, right?
There's an argument that Well, based on the reaction by the world to this show, the audience, the fan base of Tolkien's work is alive and well in every shape and form. You know what I
I
mean?
think it's what here's another problem. I'm sorry. I get heated with these things.
Good.
Um, here's another problem is that they think that a new audience has to be created. But it is. Every time somebody watches The Lord of the Rings or reads the book and becomes a fan, it has reached the audience.
Or The Hobbit, which people usually read around
Right.
puberty age. You know what I mean?
It has
Sometimes
reached
younger.
the audience is growing with each
Yeah.
generation, with each person that watches the movies or reads the books. It's already done it.
Hmm.
The idea that making something new will reach more people is
Reshaping the legendarium.
yeah,
That's what
so
this
the
person said.
reshaping isn't doing anything.
It's
The
making it
original
worse.
work the original work, and then the, work that Peter Jackson did, which is a basically a love letter to Tolkien,
Hmm.
with those movies, those are what's making new fans
Look,
and
and
reaching a new audience.
they also go on to quote how Tolkien's didn't really like any idea of adapting his story into the
Mhm.
screen. And so, as much as a filmmaker can have a love story, a love letter to Tolkien, Peter Jackson did it. All right.
Yeah, it's already been done.
It's already been done. And maybe it's very possible Tolkien wouldn't have liked Peter Jackson's adaptations. But Peter Jackson had the purest of intentions making
Mhm.
those movies, and he's a filmmaker. And so that's the way he was able to do it. Um, so, yes, there's an argument that maybe Tolkien didn't want anything to be made from his story. He wanted it to remain in literature.
I'm
But that's
I'm
not what we
gonna
are.
here's my hot take. I think Tolkien would have enjoyed the movies.
You
I think
think?
Tolkien had an understanding of film and filmography in his time, um, and should he have been alive when the movies were made and seen what these people were doing with their actions, with their acting and performances, and the time and effort and everything that is put into these movies, and you can't watch them without realizing how much efforts were was
Right.
put into these movies, especially if you watch the behind the scenes.
Well, think about this. Christopher Lee, pretty sure, met Tolkien himself,
Oh yeah,
and
he
he
told
was on
Tolkien.
board for the movies.
Yeah, he was told. Wasn't he told by Tolkien that he could play Gandalf?
I don't know, maybe something like that. But he
I want to say that
interacted
he
with
even
Tolkien in
told Ian
person.
McKellen that
Right.
Tolkien himself told him that he could play Gandalf.
But the
You
thing
know?
is, and if someone who has the highest respect for Tolkien, who met Tolkien, who's had conversations with
Mhm,
Tolkien, like Christopher Lee, who literally knew the Middle Earth languages before they started filming, right?
mhm.
And he was on board to be a part of Peter Jackson's vision of the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
That's that should be good enough for anybody, in my opinion.
Mhm.
Um, it's not a perfect cosign, but it's about as close as you can get. Um, and then it goes on to just talk more to solidify the points that they've made. Okay.
Mhm.
With all of that being said, with all these ideas that we've thrown out there, I think the biggest idea around this idea that I think about this often. So like if you're not aware, the Chosen series is out, and a lot of the fan base for the Chosen, not even the fan base, people who are believers or like or you know are Christians are split because they say, okay, well, they're adding a bunch of stuff to the story of the disciples, and so it's not scriptural, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's the biggest thing that the chosen sets out to do is not to contradict scripture. So if they add something to the backstory or the life of a disciple or the family life of a disciple, right? It may not be in the Bible, but they're not going to do something that's going to contradict the Bible. I
Right.
do believe that when Peter Jackson and, Fran Walsh and everybody set out to create these movies, they were intentional to say, if we change something or if we add something, it is not to contradict the story or the
Mhm.
characters and of who they are, right?
And I think they gather in the movies the essence. Even
Right.
it, and more than that, you could say they gather the essence in the theatrical version of
Right.
the characters. More than that in the extended editions.
Yes.
Um, but they gather the essence of each character from
Mhm.
the book. I mean, uh, um, I would even say that Aragorn is more nuanced in the movies than he is in the
A bit
books.
more, yeah.
Um,
I'm
and
sure there's disagreements about that, but
yeah, but it's a storytelling element. It just every character um, has a moment, has a story, and if you read the books, you may like certain characters more than others, but in the movies, you know that message gets through.
Mhm.
It gets through that each of these characters is unique and special, and they took time and attention to put it on screen.
And all that you have said and all that I have said cannot be said for the Rings of Power.
Mhm.
And so I thoroughly, thoroughly disagree with Angel Shaw in this Screen Rant article that she, I guess, is okay with Tolkien's work being changed in the Rings of Power and using Tolkien's actions when crafting the story as an excuse for it.
Yeah.
Like, I think that is
You know
ridiculous.
how this reads to me?
Hmm.
It's like, "I am a fan just like you."
You're not.
No, you're not.
You're
I'm a
not.
I'm a fan just like you, and this is why I like Rings of Power and how I justify its existence. Wrong, stupid. Is this a picture of Numenor behind us?
It is from the Rings of Power,
So,
and I would say
give me
the
Gondor.
animation. Look, the animation of like some of the landscapes in the Rings of Power might be the only good thing about the show.
Like, I mean, check this out,
Like
right?
in the Dwarf Kingdom, right? Might be the only good thing about the show.
The biggest issue I have with like Gondor is the areas outside of it don't feel populated, which
Mhm.
big cities are. The areas around big cities are populated with fields and all sorts of
Dense.
things. Um, this does feel populated,
Feels like New York City.
but it's like it's a great visual that would be awesome in a better show.
All right. And with that, let us know in the comments everything that you guys thought was wrong with this article. And if you disagree with us, let us know what you disagree on, in fact, because I'm very curious to hear either more in depth thoughts or arguments you might have supporting Angel Shaw in this article.
Hmm.
So let us know down in the comments as we prepare for season 2 to be released. Thanks so much for subscribing and liking this video. We'll see you next time.